Hey art nerds, today we are using this regular Blick Studio Sketchbook, and I love Blick Studio Sketchbooks. I've been using them for years. They have heavier weight sketch paper than other sketchbooks on the market, and I can also get them top spiral bound, which is my preference. But we're going to be using this Blick Studio Sketchbook today for a little bit of an experiment. So I've gone ahead and I have prepared a sketch in this sketchbook using pink color Eno lead, and I'm going to be using some of my favorite watercolors, the Da Vinci watercolor mixing set. And today I'm going to show you guys why I don't recommend you watercolor in your sketchbooks. And this is a topic that comes up a lot when I'm working with less experienced watercolor artists or newer watercolor artists, is they're using the wrong paper and then they wonder why they can't get the same results as more experienced watercolor artists. So everything else in today's tutorial is going to be the same stuff I always use. So we have a watercolor set that I really love. We have a mixing palette that obviously gets a lot of use. We're going to be using the silver black velvet watercolor brushes. I use these in a lot of my tutorials. We have our sketch done in pink pilot color Eno lead. I use this all the time for underdrawing. And the first thing I want to do is I want to apply a really wet, loose wash using phthalo blue mixed with a little bit of sap green. And one of the things I noticed painting on sketchbook paper is that watercolor colors are much more pastel, much less saturated and less vibrant than they would be even on inexpensive cellulose watercolor paper. And you guys can already see by the areas that have kind of pulled, the darker areas, this paper is absolutely not designed for wet media whatsoever. It buckles, it ripples, it pulls up. Now, I don't want to say you can't do light watercolor sketches in your sketchbook. It is your sketchbook after all. But I do want to recommend, if you're going to be using a sketchbook as an all media book, get a mixed media sketchbook or get a cellulose paper watercolor sketchbook. So I would recommend you get the Canson Biggie XL mixed media book, or you get the Canson XL watercolor book. I use both of them. I really like both of them. I use them for alcohol markers. I use them for watercolor. Now, I'll also caveat that I do use my Blick Studio Sketchbook when I do alcohol marker pieces sometimes. I actually like how it handles the marker, but that's definitely going to be a matter of preference. So one of the other things I want to point out about this paper is it's heavier than your average sketch paper. That's one of the reasons I really like the Blick Studio sketch paper, is it's a heavier weight paper. It has a nice texture. It has some tooth to it. So I'm able to achieve some things on this paper that if you were using a cheaper sketchbook paper or a thinner sketchbook paper, you would not be able to achieve. So on the blog, I talk about different paperweights as part of my my watercolor basics section. And watercolor paperweights usually come in 90-pound, 180-pound, or 300-pound papers. No, it might be 120-pound. I have to double check really quick. 140 pounds, sorry, so 90, 140, and 300-pound papers. And this has to do with the weight of a ream of paper. Sketchbook paper like this is generally 60-pound paper, so it's much thinner. I would not recommend you do watercolor on anything thinner than 90 pound. Even 90 pound is going to be very prone to buckling and to rippling. And one of the reasons the buckling is a problem is it makes it harder to paint, and it makes it much harder to paint fine details or to ink it. So once the background had a chance to kind of soak into the paper, I'm starting in with her skin tone. And I mix this color with a little bit of yellow ochre and a little bit of scarlet. Those are the two colors I usually use when I'm mixing up Caucasian and lighter skin tones. And for those of you who aren't familiar with my work, this is Kara, one of the two main characters from my webcomic, 7-inch Kara. It's entirely in watercolor. And I learned how to paint watercolor so that I could paint Kara and so that I could be a more proficient watercolor artist. So hopefully some of the stuff I'm sharing with you guys today will be helpful and inspiring. I want to make watercolor very accessible. I want people who would not normally think of trying watercolor to try watercolor. And one of the ways I know to do that is by correcting misconceptions and pointing out common points of failure. So I have a watercolor basics series here on this channel, as well as a watercolor tutorial series. I'm going to link those and loads of other great watercolor resources down in the description because I want to get you guys painting and enjoying watercolor. And if you'd like to check out more of my art, I would love it if you'd add me on Instagram at instagram.com/natosoup. I share art all the time there. So for the roses that I sketched in, I have a mix of alizarin crimson and a little bit of magenta. And you guys can see it's going down fairly dark and fairly saturated, but they're not going to dry that way. With sketchbook paper, it's just really not designed to take watercolor. I cannot stress that enough. It's not thick enough. The colors don't soak into the fibers. There isn't enough tooth to the paper to really hold on to the pigments. So you can use sketchbook paper for light watercolor studies a la Miyazaki's concept sketches if you really want to, if you're on a budget or you just really feel the need to throw some color on some of your sketches. But if you want to work in color in your sketchbook, I would recommend you go with alcohol markers or you go with a brush tip water-based marker like the Zig Clean Color Real Brush. But there's so many very affordable papers for watercolor. There's so many affordable mixed media papers that I really can't recommend using your sketchbook for watercolor when there's so many better options out there. So for this illustration, I'm really trying to do everything the way I would do it with a nicer illustration. So I'm letting my brush do a lot of the work. I'm working very carefully. I'm letting the colors kind of mix on the page. I wanted to demonstrate that you're not going to be able to do wet into wet in a sketchbook like this. So I'm dabbing in some light yellow, some cool yellow into the centers of the flowers just to kind of help demonstrate that point. Also, although the surface of the paper dries very quickly, the paper itself stays damp for a long time, which is normal if you're working with, say, a cotton rag paper will really hold on to that moisture longer. Cellulose papers tend to dry very quickly because the moisture never really seeps into the paper itself. It mostly stays on the surface. But when you're working with sketchbook paper, it doesn't have sizing in it. Now, sizing is an additive that's added to watercolor papers to give it rigidity, to give it some structure, to give it maybe some surface tooth, or to change the working properties of the paper. Sketchbook paper does not have that. I feel a little bit ridiculous because I'm putting so much time and effort into a piece that ultimately I know is not going to be as good as it could be. This kind of ties in with my art kit reviews, like when I reviewed the Master's Touch watercolor kit and when I reviewed the Artist Loft mixed media kit. When you're working with really bad art supplies or when you're just working with the wrong materials, you're not going to be able to make a piece as nice as if you had the best you could afford at the time. So I'm not one of those artists who really wants to push you to buy the most expensive things. I think there's a lot of great affordable options, and I talk about a lot of them here on this channel because I also review art supplies. I'm also happy to put together curated recommendations for you if you are interested in that. You can find a link in the description below to my Discord server, the Paint Box. It's kind of an art geekery Discord server, so if you're looking for help finding the right art supplies for you or you just want to talk about cool art stuff, you can join us there. But it's a common problem I see when people really are just trying to make the best of limited supplies. And I think there's something very noble about that. I have a lot of admiration for that. I grew up in a fairly rural area where my access to nice art supplies, my access to anything not Crayola and anything not sold through Walmart was extremely limited, and my parents didn't have a lot of money. So I 100% support working with what you've got, but I also get very frustrated seeing people go out of their way to use supplies I know are fighting them because they don't want to try something new. They're afraid to try something new, or they're waiting until this nebulous time period when they're quote-unquote good enough to justify using those art supplies. You guys are good enough now. You're certainly good enough for a Canson XL watercolor sketchbook. which is like $7. You're going to get so much use out of it. You're going to like it so much better than trying to force cheap sketchbook paper to do what watercolor paper can do. If you'd like to try cotton rag paper, there's affordable options that are really quite good. Shizen makes a hot and a cold press that are both excellent. Stonehenge hot and cold press are both really good plate papers. And Blick makes their Blick premium watercolor paper, which is also very excellent, and I've talked about it several times on this channel. I will say, though, that I'm very impressed by how well the Blick Studio Sketchbook is handling watercolor. I really expected to see pilling, paper tearing, seepage. I expected to see more buckling. I expected to see more bleeding. I thought it was going to be a lot like painting on toilet paper. So kudos to Blick for making a really sturdy sketchbook paper that can actually take a variety of media. If you wanted to do just light pen and ink sketches with a little bit of wash to it, this paper could probably have it. But one of the problems you're going to face later on is from that buckling, it's going to be very difficult to get a clean scan of what you're doing. You're going to get a lot of shadows from the paper buckling, and it's going to be difficult to get a good photograph of it as well. Also, if you intend on selling the art you make, I really cannot stress enough that you should not be doing this on sketchbook paper. It's just, there's a lot of problems with it, but we're going to just go with it's not designed to hold on to your watercolors, it's not designed to hold on to your pigments, and it's not going to stand the test of time. Some Dollar Trees also sell cellulose-based watercolor papers, and they're not necessarily very nice watercolor papers. They're about cardstock weight, but they're still going to be an improvement over using your sketchbook for your watercolors. So I'm not doing this to shame anybody. I'm not doing this to bully anybody. I just want to kind of walk you guys through why this is not such a great idea and why you should consider looking into nicer art supplies. And some companies like Canson and Stonehenge will even send you free samples of their paper if you write into them. So seriously, there isn't a good excuse not to try something better. A lot of art supply stores also have events like hands-on creativity, or they may have art days or demo days where you can come in and you can play around with things for free. Or they'll give you samples that you can take home with you for free. And some of them, if you just ask, if you say you're a beginning watercolor artist and you're new to this and you're looking for good papers, they can point you in the right direction, and they may have floor samples that you can try out. So please do not let your stubbornness, don't let your insecurity, and don't let your fear keep you from pursuing better quality materials and pursuing better art. This paper, it cannot take a lot of layers. As you guys can see from the roses, they are very much less saturated than they were. They're kind of pastel, which I was hoping for something more vibrant, but I understood that the paper would not be able to take it. Yes, watercolor can be pastel, but it doesn't have to be pastel. I have a lot of tutorials on this channel that show you guys how saturated and vibrant watercolor can be. And the Da Vinci set is one of two sets. The core mini palette is the other set that I know deliver a lot of color. So that's why I chose it. I knew it was a set that packed a punch, and I wanted to see how well the sketchbook paper could handle it. This paper also doesn't really take layers very well. Yes, you can put the layers on, and they don't really exactly slough off. You just can't see that you layered. So you may put a lot of work into paper like this to get very little in return. So if you're looking for help finding the right materials for you, if you're looking for inspiration, or if you're looking for guidance, I highly recommend you guys check out my watercolor basics series over at netosoup.blogspot.com. It's really focused more on anime art, manga art, illustration, and comics, watercolor for those sort of illustrations. So if you're a comic artist, if you have an anime or a manga aesthetic, or if you like illustration, that could be a really good place to learn about watercolor, because watercolor for fine art, watercolor for landscapes, and even larger watercolor, those all utilize different techniques than what smaller illustration style watercolor will utilize. And we cover a lot of different topics. We talk about a lot of materials, and I explain things in depth and provide great outside resources for those of you who are looking to learn more. And it's completely free. You don't have to pay a single dime, but I am reliant on the sponsorship from my patrons on Patreon to be able to financially keep things like this going, because it does consume resources. It consumes paint, it consumes paper, it consumes a lot of my time, and it also consumes knowledge. So if you're able to help support what I'm doing, please consider joining me over on patreon.com/nattosoup, or you guys can send me a one-time tip at Ko-fi, ko-fi.com/nattosoup. So I just wanted to kind of show you guys how buckled the paper is. It's kind of hard to capture it here. You can kind of see it's kipped up a bit. You can basically wibble wobble it with your fingers, which makes it increasingly difficult to paint smaller areas or to paint fine details with any kind of confidence. So if you're the sort of person who likes really detailed work, painting in your sketchbook is not the best idea. Now, perhaps if you'd already inked it first and you used a water impermeable ink, or a ink that is not going to become water soluble once you paint over it, you might have a different result. That is certainly something you could try out, but I was really dissatisfied by how much the paper buckled and warped as I was painting it. Now, of course, the more experienced watercolor artists are watching me do this and they're like, Becca, why are you painting on sketchbook paper? That's crazy. But this is something I commonly see when I'm teaching people who are newer to watercolor or people who are younger and interested in learning how to watercolor. I often see them attempting to watercolor in their existing sketchbooks, and then they wonder why it doesn't look the same way the tutorials look, or it doesn't look as good as their favorite artist on Instagram. They wonder why they're struggling, and they often blame themselves. And of course, with watercolor, you do improve as you do more of it. So yes, there is going to be a skill gap, but I firmly believe if you're working with the right materials, you will see the skill gap, but you're also going to see the potential. And that's what I want them to be able to see. I want them to see the potential. I also want to point out that I'm not dissatisfied with how this piece turned out. I think it turned out really cute. I understand that it might be a little bit confusing for some of you, because some of you may see this and you might think, well, I really like how this turned out. I don't know why she's complaining. I'm comparing this to what I know I'm capable of doing on other papers and what I've done in other videos. So for me, this is fine, but I know if I'd done it on a watercolor paper, be it a cellulose paper or a cotton rag paper, the end result would be so much better. So that's kind of why I wanted to show this to you guys today, and I wanted to talk to you about it. Personally, I'm a big fan of watercolor. I'm a big fan of traditional media. I like digital art as well, but there's just something I really love about physically manipulating the material that I'm working with. Handling an actual brush, handling actual paints, experiencing the color mixing in real time. There's something very satisfying for me about that. So at this point, I'm adding burnt sienna, leaving some highlights using the brush and the white of the paper, and I'm painting in Kara's hair. So I just generally want to share this love of watercolor, and I want it to be more accessible to people who don't necessarily think of their work as being watercolor work or appropriate for watercolor work, or that watercolor might just be out of their ability or out of their range. There's a lot of different types of watercolor. There's a lot of different ways you can apply watercolor. There's a lot of different media for watercolor, and it's really just such a wonderful material. There is a bit of an investment at the beginning, but the materials can last a really long time, and I feel like they bring so much joy. I really just love painting, and I find it so relaxing. So I hope I can share some of that passion with you guys, and also kind of share some common mistakes so you guys can avoid them. So I'm going in with a pretty thick mix of our alizarin crimson and magenta. You guys can see I'm letting the brush do most of the work. That's something I've been really working on, is allowing my brush to do a lot of the work for me. I felt for a long time that my art looked a bit too coloring book. So I wanted to improve my mark making using watercolor brushes, and I feel like that's added a bit of freshness and has really helped with my work. So I want you guys to imagine that I'm using the cheapest watercolors I could find, maybe something from Dollar Tree, with the cheapest brushes I could find with bristles going out all over the place, and trying to paint in my sketchbook. It would be a disaster. I'm not going to record that video because I've tortured myself enough with misbehaving art supplies. You guys can watch the Artist Loft kit video and the Master's Touch kit video to see what sort of frustration I would have in that scenario. But that's what I encounter a lot of less experience with watercolor artists using, and then they don't understand why their art doesn't look as good as it could, or they feel like watercolor is just a terrible medium and they really hate it, or they think it's really very difficult to use. And I understand that there isn't a lot of affordable watercolor education in many areas, or the types of people who tend to go to those classes are very different from the types of people who might be watching this video, and they may feel alienated by those classes. I know I feel alienated by those classes. Some of the people who take those classes, in my experience in my area, have been incredibly rude. So I understand not necessarily pursuing those sort of classes, which is why I'm trying to offer something a little bit different here on this channel, so that everybody can find some niche with art, some area with watercolor that they're comfortable doing. So for me, what I like to paint is I really like figurative art, I like storytelling art, hence why I have a watercolor comic, and I also really like painting natural things. I like painting animals, I like painting plants, I like painting flowers. So those are themes you're going to see in my work very frequently. I use art as a form of relaxation, but also a way to communicate with other people. And I use art to communicate the best, most wholesome feelings I can share. So when I make art, I'm trying to make it as an act of love. So most of what I make is very sweet. It's very almost saccharine, because when you're making art, you're spending a lot of time with that art. You're spending a lot of time with those feelings. And for me, drawing and painting things that are violent or gory or gruesome, it's not cathartic. I understand that for some artists it's cathartic, and I respect that, but it actually makes my anxiety spike. So I prefer to spend my time drawing and painting things that are kind of restful and enjoyable, a moment that you can escape into. So while I've been chattering on, you guys could see that I've been trying to develop the colors, I've been trying to build up layers, I've been trying to build up contrast and intensity, and that's just really not something that I've been able to do on the sketchbook paper. The buckling is not as extreme as it's dried out, but I also think, given that it's sketchbook paper and given that it has no internal structure, that is very flexible, I do think if I were to do heavy layers on a sketchbook paper, it would eventually crack and buckle off. And I think this is a problem that some people who play with gouache in their sketchbooks may find. So there are also a lot of stores will sell matte board, like when you're matting a picture. They'll sell matte board, which is kind of like a heavy, nice archival not construction paper, but like almost like a chipboard, but much nicer than that. And that can be a great practice material for like gouache and for like acrylics. And the scraps are very affordable. So that could also be a way to experiment and play with a new material without investing a lot of money into it. And of course, if you really, really, really want to, yes, you can paint in your sketchbook. It's not entirely impossible. I did have some issues with the watercolor seeping into the next page. The page under this page has just some washi tape samples on it, so I wasn't really concerned about ruining what was on the following page. But if you had something like water-soluble inks on the page underneath, that could ruin what you've applied underneath. Or if you have another watercolor illustration underneath, that could definitely ruin what you have. So I would really recommend working with a paper that's designed to handle a lot of water. And the Blick Studio Sketchbooks say they're ideal for pencil, crayon, charcoal, and pastel. Lightweight, acid-free, made in the USA. So they don't say anything about water media. They don't say anything about ideal for markers, ideal for watercolor, ideal for gouache. This is me just demonstrating why I think you guys should use better paper than sketchbook paper if you're watercoloring. So I'm just painting in some flowers on her dress using ultramarine blue, just something to kind of break it up and make it a little bit cuter, so a little bit of surface design. And back when I used to do my Power Hour live streams, I did a whole video talking about surface design and how to add patterns on fabrics and objects. I'm not really sure when I'm going to bring the Power Hours back. YouTube COPPA compliance changes have kind of hindered my channel a lot. I've lost a lot of the functionality that made YouTube enjoyable for me, including possibly chats during live streams. And quite frankly, if I don't have access to the chat, there's no reason for me to run a live stream. So I'm going to still play around and experiment with it before I make any solid plans and before I really decide what the future of this channel is going to be. But that's really a topic for another video. So even though we're using watercolor paper, I'm still trying out different layers and different thicknesses. So this is a pretty heavy mix of burnt sienna, very carefully applied because the paper has really rippled up, and it makes it, as I said earlier, very difficult to control where and how you're painting, especially if you're used to painting on a flat or mostly flat surface. Now, I will caveat that cellulose papers, even when I'm painting my Cara pages on Canson Mont Vent, they do ripple and they do buckle. Even if I stretch them, there are sometimes problems. And paper does maintain the memory of the weather the day you stretched it. So if you're stretching watercolor paper on a very humid day or on a rainy day, you're going to have buckling that will come up every time you add a loose, wet wash to your paper. So it's really ideal to try and stretch your watercolor papers on a good day with low humidity, but not so low that it dries immediately. So even quality papers can have kipping, buckling, warping issues, but the sketchbook paper does it way more, and the ripples are much higher frequency and much closer together, which makes it more difficult to control what you're doing. So something else I want to point out about as you can see, it really warped a lot. Something else I wanted to point out about the sketchbook paper is it dries fairly fast. So if you want to do wet into wet techniques, it's not really going to be feasible. It's just the paper surface is just not designed to handle that. So I allowed my watercolors to dry, and I'm going to ink this piece with some of my favorite brush pens. I have kind of a motley crew assortment of Tombow Furenosuke pens, one of the Pentel brush pens, the new ones, and also I think one of the smaller Pentel brush pens. Oh, and a Sakura Pigma FB. And this is where I really ran into a lot of problems because the paper surface has become so warped and so buckled, it's actually incredibly difficult to ink on it. And what I ended up doing is I ended up kind of holding my forefinger and my thumb right by the area I was inking and pushing the paper down so it would be a completely flat surface. So this is another reason I just cannot recommend you do watercolor in your sketchbook. And for this little watercolor illustration, I'm using various colored inks for inking. If I used just black, it would have kind of a heavy effect to it. It would definitely pull everything together, but it would add a lot of dark contrast. Whereas using colored pens that kind of reflect the colors that are actually used keeps everything very light and very vibrant and doesn't add a lot of additional contrast. once I finished inking, I apply a little bit of white gouache to my non-porous craft surface, add a little bit of water until I get kind of a cream-like consistency, and I'm going to use this to paint highlights back into my piece. So I want to point out that everything I did for this watercolor illustration is the same things that I do when I'm working on Shizen cotton rag watercolor paper, or when I'm working on like Canson Montval watercolor paper, or when I'm working on Biggie XL watercolor paper. So any of my standalone, looser sort of watercolor sketches like I have here on this channel, it's all the same as what I do for those. And I did this way because I really wanted everything to be the same except for the paper. So we could really focus on why the paper is not necessarily the best choice for your watercolor illustration needs. And I feel like by now, those of you who were going to be convinced by me with this sort of argument are probably convinced. You probably get where I'm coming from. And those of you who need to find out for yourself, or you need to experiment for yourself, are probably 100% not convinced. And I respect that. I really encourage you guys to find out for yourself, to experiment for yourself. Get a hold of some samples from Canson, from Strathmore, from Fluid. Try painting on those. See if you like that better than what you were doing in your sketchbook. And if you don't like it better, why change what you're doing? If it works for you, there's no reason to stop. But if you like it better, it may be time to consider switching over to something that works for you. I know the Mossery sketchbooks are pretty popular. I have a few myself. They're fun to use, but they're very overpriced for what they are. And I can say this because Mossery doesn't sponsor me, so I don't owe them anything. I like them. They're cute, but they're not very affordable. 30 bucks a pop compared to less than $10 for a Canson XL sketchbook. I would say get the Canson XL sketchbook. They sell them everywhere. I see them at Walmart, I see them at Michael's, I see them at Plaza, I see them at Jerry's, I see them at Blick. You can get them almost anywhere. Go for one of those, try one of those. I think you guys will like it a lot better. One of the other perks of using a mixed media or a watercolor sketchbook is it can really take almost anything you throw at it. Pastels, charcoals, inks. You can use more media with that as your sketchbook than you'd be able to if you're just doing everything in your sketchbook. So I want to thank you guys so much for joining me today. Hopefully I convinced you, but if not, hopefully I convinced you to at least experiment with something new. I want to thank you guys so much for watching. If you like what I do and you want to help me do it, please consider joining me on Patreon. I'm going to have links to everything down in the description below, as well as links to other tutorials and my watercolor basics series. So those of you who want to learn how to watercolor can work along with that. It's a pleasure sharing my art with you guys, and if you guys would like to see my art as I make it, you can join me on Instagram at instagram.com/NataSue. Have a wonderful day, guys. Bye!